Greetings, everyone. This episode is episode 18 of Canadian Meets the South. Today, I will be reviewing The Pope Who Would Be King by David I. Kertzer. Sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. And it's about Pope Pius the Pope Pius IX. And I initially went into the book thinking it would cover his entire life, but it was more like the first 3 years. I was interested in Pius IX because of his relationship with Confederate President Jefferson Davis. But he referred to he wrote to the president as illustrious President Jefferson Davis or something. Like you can read his letters online, but this was in the 60s, and then he told Davis that he also felt like a prisoner in his own country. But the book doesn't go into that. It goes into the fall of the Papal States, how for over 1,000 years the Papal States was ruled by the Pope as if he was a king. And Pius IX was the last of those kings. He was initially a reformer when he became Pope in 1846. And he gave the people of the Papal States, which included Rome, a constitution with rights. And he even let the Jews have some more rights, because prior to that, the Jews lived in a ghetto. Well, they lived in ghettos all over Italy. And in the ghettos, they didn't have property rights, and they needed special permission whenever they wanted to leave. And yeah, well, what happened was he got swept in the tide of reform. The people of the Papal States loved him at that time, and he kept giving them more reforms for 2 years. But then the issue of Italian unification came up. At the time, Austria held a part of northeastern Italy. Italy was not yet a country. To the northwest, it was the Kingdom of Sardinia and Piedmont. To the south was the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, or the two Sicilies. And to the east were the Austrian Empire. Well, it was like Lombardy and Venice, like around that area. So Pius IX was, compared to his predecessor Gregory XVI, a reformer, but people loved him so much they thought that he was in favor of Italian unification, which he never said was a bad idea. I think maybe deep down he thought it was a good idea, but he was not willing to wage a war against the Austrians, who were also Catholic. And long story short, his prime minister got assassinated Pius IX's prime minister, and then he had to flee into exile in the Kingdom of Naples, well, and Sicily, under the protection of King Ferdinand. So from then, uh, yeah, the people thought he was a traitor after some of them attacked the Austrians in the northeast and under his name. And Pius didn't, you know, condone that action because, like I said before, he wasn't going to wage a war against fellow Catholics. And so the people of the Papal States thought, okay, he's a traitor to Italy, and stopped loving him, and that's why he fled. And then the French come in, and France was at the time the only republic, and it was under Napoleon III, the only Catholic republic. The other Catholic nations at the time were, yeah, the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and Piedmont, or like it was under the House of Savoy, and Austria, well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, I might have some of those names wrong when it comes to the revolutions of 1848, but and I guess Spain. And yeah, France was the only republic, and they decided to resecure the Papal States for the king, for the Pope. And during this time, the period immediately after the Pope's flight was the short-lived Roman Republic, in which there was a constitution that guaranteed freedom of expression, freedom of the press and of speech, freedom of religion, because at the time you could only be Catholic and Jewish, and the Jews had to live in the ghettos, and they abolished the death penalty, which was radical in general at the time, because this was the first constitution to do that, and they got rid of they destroyed the guillotines there in the Papal States, or at the time now the Roman Republic. Now, the ones other than the abolishment of the death penalty, these were probably radical by European standards, but not by American standards, certainly. Before Virginia was the first to guarantee freedom of religion, and before that, Pennsylvania, which was established by William Penn, who was a Quaker, had religious pluralism, which was, you could say, pretty close to religious freedom. You were allowed to go and practice and in Pennsylvania any faith, as long as you said you believed in the Almighty God. So that, I guess, included Jews, but not necessarily Buddhists, and certainly not any atheistic faith, or just not, or or lack of faith. But yeah, I mean, I bring up Buddhism because Buddhism isn't a theistic religion. What else? But yeah, it was a radical idea. I mean, by European standards, the Roman Republic was very radical when it came to reforms. And then, but it was a short-lived republic, and another republic, the only other Catholic republic, I guess it was the Third French Republic or the Second French Republic, put it down. And at the time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs was Alexis de Tocqueville, and he was pressuring his underlings to pressure the Pope to institute the reforms that he had before, at least give back the Constitution, as in after they took Rome for him, and the rule by the priests was in effect again. And I mean, yeah, it became a theocracy again. And this time, the cardinals were telling the Pope, "No, your initial mistake was doing all of these reforms. You cannot go back to doing these reforms." While the French kept pressuring him to do these reforms, pressuring the Pope to at least have some of the reforms that he had prior. And this time, the Pope was listening to his cardinals, and his right hand man was Cardinal Antonelli, and whom many people hated because the Pope really was getting tired of politics, and he just wanted Antonelli to do the political thing while he was in his he would be a spiritual leader. But yeah, the end of the Papal States would come years later with Risorgimento, Italy being unified. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies would fall to the House of Savoy, which was in the west of Italy, north and west, and that was the only place. Well, that was also, like, how do I say this? I think a constitutional monarchy existed in 1848. Like, it was one of the successful places during the revolutions of 1848. And yeah, eventually they took the House of Savoy took the Italian part of the Austrian Empire as well, and then eventually took Rome and the Papal States. And the Pope retreated to the Vatican City and said he was a prisoner there, and excommunicated the king of the House of Savoy, Victor Emmanuel II, and from Pius IX to Pius XI, the popes would insist that they were prisoners. And but he was initially under the protection of French for a long time, but then Napoleon, who became emperor after, because he was term limited under the Republic, declared war on France. No, they declared war on Austria, and around this time, Vatican I, Pius IX declares papal infallibility, and that also gave him the excuse, that gave Napoleon III the excuse to pull his troops out and focus on fighting Austria. And yeah, the French, the Pope wasn't listening to the French. Like they kept asking him to institute these reforms because otherwise it would just look like one republic had put down another republic for nothing, and it was expensive, and it wasn't a global. It would be a global embarrassment for France and undermine their other relationships. But yeah, at the time when he became when the Pope became when Pius IX became the Pope, it was Polk who was president, and I think he sent Louis Cass, or maybe that was later on, to be the ambassador to the Holy See or something. But yeah, it really doesn't go too much into details on the Pope's relationship with the United States. And yeah, at the time I'm Catholic, if I haven't said this before, and I fully well, I don't maybe that's not the right word, but I appreciate more that the ideas of religious freedom and freedom of the press and of expression and speech, these were considered radical ideas during Pius IX's term as Pope. And, well, the Papal States were a theocracy. But, of course, if you were a Catholic at the time in North America, you wouldn't really feel the authoritarianism of the Pope. Yeah, but yeah, um, the the Pope changed ideologically from being a reformer to being more of an absolute monarchist, and he he was being swept up in the tide of Italian unification. That's another thing, and this is also definitely a left wing thing. The revolutions of 1848 and eventually Risorgimento in the 60s, which is basically destroying local self government and centralizing power in in uh, in a single government. In the Kingdom of Italy's case, in the capital was Rome. So as well as there were different Italian languages. Now they call them il dialetti, the dialects. For example, in Rome, you would have Romanesco in which is the Roman dialect. Um, the Pope's father, I mean the current Pope's father, Francis, his father was from Piedmont, and that's why Pope Francis also speaks Piedmontese, which is quote unquote dialetti, no, dialetto, rather than in Italy that's what they refer to it, even though there are different languages. Not to mention Sicilian's its own unique language. Uh, Neapolitan is its own. Venetian is its own. Genoese or Ligurian, which is what Christopher Columbus spoke, was his native language. He was from Genoa, and actually, Pope Francis's mom's family is partly from Genoa, and also partly from Piedmont. But yeah, see, Italy, you can make the argument, is more linguistically diverse than America, because in America you can say that there are English dialects, but Italy, although they're calling them Italian dialects, they are more like languages, just about, but they're dialects now because of politics, centralized power. Of course, like me, like admiring the American Southern tradition. I I like the American Southern tradition, and one of the reasons why was it is that it's held on to the idea of states' rights the longest. Speaking of which, there's this petition that successfully passed um, in Texas, where in which independence is now on the ballot for the Republican primaries, and I think this is going to be pretty important because um, the GOP controls both houses of the state legislature as well as the governor's mansion. So it's not for a general election; it's for the primaries. Uh, but the I guess one of the president of the Texas nationalist movement, he's been working since August 1996 for Texas's independence, and it takes a while. You can't just have independence in a year. Like it takes several years of work to get to where they are. And if Texas leaves, the rest of the red states are gonna look at that and say, "There's no way we're gonna win the presidency again." So we're gonna have to also leave somehow. Likely Oklahoma is gonna leave, and New Hampshire, which isn't really red, it's more like purple. But how do I say this? The governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, is pretty free market guy. And the state legislature both are is red in both houses, but federally they vote blue. But yeah, the state government is more important, and they're much more free market. Like they don't have a state income tax or a sales tax. So yeah, I would say it is the most free market right now because they got rid of the state income tax, I think, in 2023. If we were talking about uh, who was the most free market during the height of the pandemic, you can definitely say South Dakota because they didn't lock down at all. Then they didn't institute mask mandates, and I kind of wanted to be in South Dakota at the time. I didn't want to be locked up, but you know, it's as it is right now. It is hard to legally immigrate, at least for me, unless you apply for using like the TN visa. Like this visa recently came out for it's for Canadians and Mexicans. Um, and yeah, you need like a degree or at least a college diploma, and you need to be sponsored, I think, by an employer. But it's easier than other nations people of other countries trying to get in. And like New Hampshire's in the it's in New England, and I, as someone who sympathizes with the South, I'm not really a fan of New England. I'm not a fan of the East, anything east of Canada, to be honest. I don't like Quebec, New France, and I certainly don't like the Yankees who live in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Labrador, Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI. So they are more to the left. I prefer like going to Alberta. I mean, even Saskatchewan would be an up. Would be an upside compared to Ontario. Recently, Bonnie Crombie, who is the mayor of the city that I live in, Mississauga, won the Ontario Liberal leadership race. So she wants to be premier. The question is whether or not she's going to be more fiscally responsible. She probably will be if she wins. More fiscal responsible, at least compared to Kathleen Wynne. Whether or not she pushes more DEI things, because she identifies as a social progressive. Though she pushes, like the sexualization of kids. We'll see. I mean, obviously, I prefer living in Alberta. Like, I prefer the premier of there, even though, Danielle Smith, even though she is not that socially conservative, but she is willing to go to bat for her people against the federal government, and that's what I like. She reminds me of South Carolinian politicians during the nullification crisis. So like James Hamilton, the governor at the time, who stepped down because Calhoun wanted to take Robert C. Haynes' spot in the Senate. Well, Hayne would go become the governor. But yeah, this is, like I said before, I like Alberta. I like the Smith government's Alberta Sovereignty within the United Canada Act. And then afterwards, well, Scott Moe's government in Saskatchewan passed the Saskatchewan First Act. But it's like he's more of a follower, which is okay when the leader of Alberta is good, but it's when the leader of Alberta becomes NDP, it won't be good. You may not be able to rely on Mo as he is right now. If he changes and becomes more bold and more of a provincial rights guy, then sure. I mean, if I haven't said this before, I like Oliver Mowat. He was the Liberal Premier of Ontario for, I think, 24 years. This is back when John A. Macdonald was Prime Minister, and he was a constant thorn in Macdonald's side because he was always advocating for provincial rights and following the Constitution. But yeah, if Texas becomes independent, I'm gonna wonder what's gonna happen to Alberta. Alberta will also be emboldened. I mean, they would be landlocked. I would like to go to Alberta, even if the social progressivism of some of the conservatives turns me off. Like for example, I really don't like Michelle Rempel Garner. She's from Calgary, and yeah, she likes pushing the pride stuff. I mean, she will stand up for oil and gas, but yeah, like it really turns me off, the social progressivism of some of these conservatives. And another thing, like Chris Sununu, yeah, I mean, he does identify as pro-choice, and he did recently endorse Nikki Haley, who is a neocon, a warmongering neocon, who broke her promise when she said she wouldn't run if Trump was running for president. But yeah. New Hampshire's still a great place, and I wonder if they'll also secede if Texas secedes. But yeah, thank you for listening to Canadian Meets the South. I'll see you next time, probably in the new year. So Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all my viewers. Thank you. See you in 2024.